Tonight, getting into Hebrews chapter 8. And this kind of continues exactly what we had talked about last time from Hebrews chapter 7, where we had seen that Jesus is this high priest like Melchizedek. He is like Melchizedek, but he is better than Melchizedek in that he is actually Jesus Christ and our intercessor and our ongoing high priest, and that his priesthood supersedes the priesthood of the Levites and the priesthood of the Israelites. And so as far as an outline that we've got, last time we had just concluded chapter 7 talking about the high priest who meets our needs. In verses 26 and 27 there in the yellow, we see the tasks that he undertakes and his character, that he is set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. He does not need to offer sacrifices day after day because he sacrificed for their sins once for all. And he is superior to the Levites also in respect to the fact that he is more than a man. He's not merely a man. He is certainly a man, but he's more than a man because he's also the Son of God. And he was appointed and called to that office in the Word of God in Psalm 110. I declare on oath I forever in the order of Melchizedek. So before we get into chapter 8, were there any questions from last time or anything else that we needed to discuss? If you can see the chat, if you're using Zoom, I'll put it in the Facebook comments. But the registration for attending church on Sunday is that bit.ly/RELC resume. And then if you wanted to read the rationale and why we do what we do, bit.ly/RELC resume 1, the number 1, and it's all lowercase. We can talk about that a little bit at the end if you would like. Hopefully I gave everybody a chance to think if there were any questions left over from last time. All right, that gets us into chapter 8. And the contrast, we had just seen back in chapter 7 that Jesus is better than all of the other priests because he is superior to them in every way, including being a priest in the order of Melchizedek. That's kind of the major idea of chapter 7. Although he brought in a lot of the other aspects to that, including in verses 21 and 22. I'll stop scrolling here for a minute. In verses 21 and 22, the part in blue on your screen, you are a priest forever, verse 21. And verse 22, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. That verse 22, actually introduces the main thought for the next chapter 8. And the idea is this, that if somebody is going to represent the people to God or represent God to the people, that is in the context of a particular relationship that we would call a covenant relationship. Is in the business world or in this world, we might call it a contract. A contract relationship. A covenant is basically a serious contract, and it's undertaken in the exact same way that the two parties, let's say you're buying a house or you're buying a car, you enter into a contract where the person who is the buyer puts down a down payment, and then the two parties sit down together, they discuss the terms, and then they agree to those terms and they sign on the bottom line. And that contract is then entered. With a covenant, really what marks a covenant is that it is sealed in blood. The Old Testament covenant that God made with the nation of Israel was sealed with the blood of bulls and goats, and especially when they ratified the covenant at Mount Sinai, they sacrificed these bulls and these bulls in particular, and then sprinkled the blood on the people and against the altar and on the Ark of the Covenant. That Ark of the Covenant represented God's presence among the people, and it was also the most secure location in the entire nation of Israel. And so the 10 Commandments were the basic terms of that covenant. The 10 Commandments, both copies of the 10 Commandments were kept there. First of all, God's copy was kept there because that Ark of the Covenant represented God, and the people's copy was kept there because the Ark of the Covenant was the most secure place in the entire nation of Israel. It just happened that it was the exact same location. And then when Moses had read out the book of the covenant, the book of the law, he had read it to the people, and they said, "We will do this. We agree." Then he slaughtered the bull, collected the blood, and sprinkled it on the people, and sprinkled it on the Ark of the Covenant, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that now marks you." And it's in that context that the Levites served as priests, that they served as priests under that covenant or on the basis of that relationship to God with the particular stipulations laid out in the book of the law. All of the sacrifices and the celebrations and the festivals, they were all dictated for them in the book of the law, as well as a lot of insight as to how they should handle diseases and that concept of being clean or unclean. Even that entire concept of being clean or unclean under the law is explained for us in the book of the law, or the book of the covenant. And you can see that it's, if you look at the book of Leviticus in particular, and then that would be a good place to start. And the book that would detail most of it. The book of Deuteronomy is kind of a second reading of that covenant law that God had with the nation of Israel, and it's in that context. And this is the assumption that the author to the Hebrews has, that you kind of have this understanding of the covenant relationship that God had with the nation of Israel on the basis of the law that he had read to them, and on the basis of the sacrifices that sealed that covenant or ratified that covenant, that they were members of that covenant relationship being served by those priests because the blood of that old covenant had marked them. That even if the nation of Israel, alive, and the people that he's writing to here, Moses was 1400 years, nearly 1500 years previously, and they weren't alive at that time, obviously, but they were descendants and participants in that same covenant that was sealed with the blood of the bulls, and that was administered to them through the work of the Levites and the priests. And that's the idea that he introduces back in chapter 7, verse 22, that because of this oath, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. And this idea of a better covenant is pretty much what he talks about for chapter 8. So we'll just start reading. Chapter 8. The point of what we are saying is this: we do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by man. Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, and so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already men who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown to you on the mountain. But the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, and it is founded on better promises. For if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said, the time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant, verse 10. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sin no more. And if we, a little bit later in this class time, we'll look at Jeremiah 31, and what you basically see is it's just a verbatim copy straight out of Jeremiah 31, exactly what he wrote there. So, talking about this idea of a covenant, the covenant is the basis of God's relationship with his people. That he wants to enter into a relationship, and he sets down the terms, and then the terms are sealed with blood, or signed on the dotted line is kind of a way. And God did this a couple of different times in a couple of different ways. The first one that might come to mind is at the end of the flood. I think that's in Genesis, right at the end of Genesis chapter 8, or beginning of chapter 9. This is the covenant that God makes with Noah and his family after the flood. The ark has landed on Mount Ararat. The doors are sacrificed, some clean animals in sacrifice to the Lord, and then God blesses them, and he lays down the terms of the covenant. Um, this very first part, verses 1, 2, and 3 are what God says that he is going to do. And this is a blessing that he places on them. In verse 1, when he says, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth, it's the exact same thing that we had back in Genesis chapter 1, in like verses 25 or 26, when God said about Adam and Eve, about the first man and woman, to be fruitful and fill the earth. It is a command, yes, but that command is also a blessing, in that command has the ability to carry out what God is commanding. So this is what God promises to do, that he promises to bless them in number, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Verse 2, the fear and dread of you will fall upon all the beasts of the earth and birds of the air, upon every creature that moves along the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands, so that God is saying, first of all, you can go hunting and fishing, and then secondly, that you aren't gonna be fearful of these animals in the same way that perhaps they had been previously. That the lion and the tiger and the bear, oh my, they're gonna be afraid of you rather than fearless toward you in this new world. Number 3, verse 3, everything that lives and moves will be food for you, just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. And he continues, verses 4 through 8. He continues by laying out the rest of the terms of the covenant. And he says, you must not eat meat that still has its lifeblood in it. Verse 5, I will surely demand an accounting for your blood. I'll demand an accounting from every animal, and from each man I'll demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made man. And he concludes with that same thing that he opened with, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. Those are the terms of the covenant, of what the expectations are, and then and what God is blessing them with. And the last part of it is way down here in verse 11. Verse 9 here in Genesis chapter 9, we've got who are the parties to this covenant, verses 9 and 10. Exactly the same way that, if you've signed on a house or purchased a car, or taken out a loan or something like that, they delineate very clearly who are the parties to this contract. And that's what God does here. Until verse 11, the final aspect to his covenant is that never again would there be a flood to destroy the entire earth. And God gives a sign of the covenant in this covenant. He says, I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And God repeats himself again here in verse 17, 16 and 17, I guess. Basically, we don't know if the rainbow had existed before then, or maybe God just attached some special meaning to it now, or if the rainbow is now a special creation that God now built into this new world after the flood. But whichever it happens to have been, God attaches a special meaning to it, that this rainbow is the sign of the covenant. And that's the first covenant that we've got. here in Genesis. Another covenant, and we won't look at all of these. Another covenant is this one-sided covenant that God made with Abram in Genesis chapter 12. And you notice it's strictly one-sided. God says, well, yeah, leave your people. And in order to encourage him in this, God says, here are the 7 things that I'm going to do. I'll make you into a great nation. I'll bless you, make your name great. You'll be a blessing, etc. And God then reiterates that over the course of Abram's life to make sure that Abram is reassured that God is going to carry out that promise. Chapter 15, God is the big reiterating of that covenant or restating of it, where God says, look up at the heavens and count the stars. If indeed you can, so shall your offspring be. And Abram believed the Lord. But that covenant, or the promise of that covenant, was already right back here in chapter 15, Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, when God says, I am your shield, your very great reward. And it's basically a reminder of this covenant relationship that God had established with Abram back in Genesis chapter 12. But then if you keep reading, God goes to great lengths to reassure Abram after Abram is like, you know what, I don't have any kids. I'm, pushing 100 here. And they set up this covenant ceremony, I suppose, where we use these animals, a heifer, a goat, and a ram, along with a dove and a young pigeon. And this apparently was a formula for a very serious covenant, and Abraham at that time and place, where Abram cuts all these animals in half and arranges them. I don't know if he cut them like stem to stern or just right down the middle. That would probably be simpler and easier. But it's a very, very bloody thing, obviously. And Abram separates them. So you've got, maybe the head end at this part and the tail end at the other part. And he sits there all day. And and the way that this covenant apparently was executed was that the two parties to the covenant would walk between the halves. And I've heard a couple of different explanations, and about the only way that I can reconcile it all is that there's a slightly lesser form of the covenant that says, well, if I don't keep my side of the deal, then you can do this to all of my animals, totally decimate my wealth. And the most serious type of the covenant, if I don't keep my side of the deal, then you can do this to me. And then both parties would take a walk down the middle of these animal halves arranged thus, and then they would seal the covenant, with a handshake or whatever they happen to do. And God reiterates that this is a one-sided covenant in the way that he demonstrates and finishes this covenant ceremony. Verse 17, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And Abram doesn't walk between the pieces. Only this fire pot with a blazing torch does, representing God. That is God promising to keep his side of the covenant and promising to keep his promise that he had made all the way back in Genesis chapter 15. Excuse me. And then finally, the sign of the covenant is this covenant of circumcision, where God, again, does the same thing. Just a second. God does the same thing, and and he reiterates this covenant with Abram. And God says, I will confirm my covenant between me and you and increase your numbers. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You'll be the father of many nations. And so this is God promising something. And the promise of this covenant, the original covenant that God made all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, was that God would provide an heir. And so this covenant is signed or sealed, or the sign of this covenant is this rite of circumcision. Um, and this is, the way they translate, this is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And he goes into, great detail about this for, like 3 or 4 more verses. But that's the heart of it. That if a man wanted to convert and be a member of and live under the promise of Abraham and walk in the faith of Abraham, then that man had to be circumcised. And if he rejected that circumcision, then he was basically rejecting the gospel promise that God had made back in Genesis chapter 12. But the main thing that we see with all of these, and so, rewind. So then circumcision is another sign of the covenant, that God really does for the sake of his people. Because God doesn't have an opinion either way, really. And God doesn't need circumcision as though it in some way were to earn his satisfaction. But this was a sign for Abraham that, every day he would be reminded that, yes, the Lord would provide an heir from his own body, an heir who was his own biological son. And the eventual heir of that child would be the Savior of the world. And all of these people who are participants in that covenant, the men would likewise be circumcised because they share in the same faith as Abraham. What we see later on, about 500 to 600 years later, when the Israelites enter the promised land, we see that there they are living among these Canaanites and slowly driving them out and slowly killing them, because that's what God had said to do as part of his punishment on them for rejecting him. As they are doing that, this idea of circumcision was very detestable to them. And in a sense, it helped to keep the Israelites separated from the pagan nations around them, which, it probably came up as a topic of conversation because the Canaanite religion, every form of Canaanite religion is very sexualized in not a good way, in a very graphic and gory kind of way. And I could refer you to a book or two that will give you all the detail that you didn't want to know, but I'll just let it suffice with that. And so when God makes this the sign of the covenant, it's a very purposeful thing, that he is, yes, reminding Abram and his male descendants that their eventual heir would be the Savior of the world, and also planning ahead to help keep his people separate from the pagan nations around them, in this area or this element or this covenant act that would have been detestable to them. That comes up again in the New Testament, especially in Galatians, but in a very different context, because by that time, 1400 years later, 2000 years later, I guess, this idea of circumcision was that circumcision is something that I do in order to make myself a member of God's people, rather than the original gospel context of Genesis 12 and 15 and 17, that this is a reminder of God's promise to me. Okay. And it's all of that is in the background when we get to Hebrews chapter 8. We've basically got one more covenant before we get to Hebrews chapter 8. And the only real covenant in between the covenant, well, Abram, they've got the temporary covenant that God made with his nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. That was, what we talked about earlier with the reading of the law, the blood of the bulls, and the sacrifices with the Levitical priesthood. There's that covenant, but that it comes after the covenant of Abraham, and it is a covenant based on the law and according to that religious ceremony that God had set up. The only other covenant that comes up is the one that's mentioned here in Hebrews chapter 8, which is a direct quote from Jeremiah 31. And that's the covenant that we're focusing on tonight. That among all of these different ways that God has established and promised to establish an ongoing relationship with his people, Jesus is the high priest of this new covenant, of this better covenant. In chapter 7, we saw that Jesus is this high priest who continually serves in a better priesthood. Now we see that he's a high priest who serves in a better covenant. And so that's that's exactly what the preface is. Verse 1 of this chapter, it just summarizes what we just covered in chapter 7. He's like,
So are you saying
yeah,
that
sorry, I didn't
circumcision is not two-sided?
No, circumcision was not intended as a two-sided covenant, as though, and if you read Galatians, by the time of Paul, by the time of the New Testament era, circumcision was seen as my act toward God and something that I do toward God. But God's purpose in circumcision was to be this reminder of that they are participants in that covenant. There's really no law compulsion in that covenant of circumcision, in that covenant sign of circumcision, because circumcision is just a sign of the covenant that God had made back in Hebrews, or in Genesis chapter 12. And if a man chose not to participate in that, and then he would basically be giving up on the promises that God had made as a one-sided promise back in Genesis chapter 12, and forsaking all of that. Did that cover it?
Yep. Thank you.
Cool. So that's a heck of a lot of background, but I think it's helpful for us to see exactly what is going on, because he's like, talking about this comparison between the priests who were then serving at the temple in Jerusalem. Here, I'll leave that there, and in the priests that we have now serving forever in the heavenly temple. And so we talk about offering gifts and sacrifices, and that this Jesus has to have something to offer. That's just part of the priest, the activity of the priest. And the fact is that he has to be a better priest who serves in a better place, because if you were on verse 4, if you were on earth, you would not be a priest, because there's already men who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. And what he's really going to expand on is that our better priest serves in a better place because he serves as a participant in this better covenant. So the sanctuary that the men on earth serve, let's see, what color should we use? Yeah, we'll stick with green, talking about the things of the earth. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. And Jesus is the one who serves at this heavenly sanctuary, so to speak. And he refers to, in verse 5, he refers here to Exodus 25. You see the footnote there, that Moses was given strict guidelines to say that you make everything according to the pattern shown to you on the mountain. Because the point that he's making is that what you have on earth is an imitation of something better. And we have a priest who serves at this something better. The ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is a mediator is superior to the old one, and it is founded on better promises. And that's kind of the big idea, that the covenant that the people in Israel at Jerusalem, at that temple, the covenant in which they were working, we didn't even look at that that covenant from Mount Sinai, but it was a two-sided covenant where God said, if you do this, if you follow my covenant, then you will be my people. If you do not, then I will forsake you. And that really described Israelite history for the next 1,000 years, from 1400 BC, the time of Moses, all the way down to 400 BC, the time of Malachi, that those people were living under that old covenant, that covenant that was conditional, that was based on the law, that was based on them keeping their side of it. The if you do this, then God promised the other side, then they would be his people and God would prosper them. And they continually fell short. And so what he's really saying here is that you see in the green, the covenant here on earth, the covenant there at the temple in Jerusalem, is according to the law, and it is a copy and a shadow, verse 5, and it is this old covenant, and it is an inferior covenant, because the ministry of Jesus, verse 4, is not on earth, but it is in heaven, verse 5. In verse 6, this ministry of Jesus is superior because the covenant is superior, because the covenant isn't founded on the law, but on promises that are better than the law. And the promises that God really refers to here, it sets up this comparison. If you compare verse 4 with verse 6, about verse 4 offering the gifts prescribed by the law in green, compared to verse 6, these better promises in orange. What we're really talking about there is law and gospel. That verse 4, they were fulfilling the obligations of that conditional covenant that God had made with them at Mount Sinai. The if you keep this law, then you'll be my people, the if then kind of clause. But the covenant that is superior is the covenant that Jesus fulfills as our priest in the order of Melchizedek, and as our priest who is a participant in this greater covenant that God made in Genesis 12, that is actually superior because it was earlier and sooner. But he could make that same comparison that he made with the priesthood of Melchizedek and the Levitical priesthood. He could make that same comparison with the covenant that was established by Moses at Mount Sinai and the covenant that God had made previously with Abraham back in Genesis 12. But instead, the writer to the Hebrews brings in one of the later prophets. And what he's really doing is he's already nailed down the idea of Abraham, that Abraham preceded all of their Levitical law-bound ideas. He has chased down the Psalms and King David. So we have the law and the Psalms, and he brings in somebody from the prophets, because, and this is kind of one of those background things that's really interesting once it makes sense. The Jewish people call their scripture the Tanakh. That's kind of their short form, TNK. For T meaning Torah, the law of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. The N, Nevi'im, is the prophets. Man, my Hebrew's a little rusty. Is the prophets, and then the Ketuvim is the songs, or maybe I have those second and third reversed. But anyway, it's the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And Jesus uses that phrase in the New Testament when he talks about everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. What he's doing is referring to the 3 major divisions of the Old Testament. And he's saying that he had to fulfill everything that was written about him in the Old Testament. He's not just picking and choosing, 3 or 4 books. He's referring to the 3 major divisions, kind of like, you and I might refer to the New Testament in, talking about the Gospels and talking about the epistles as the 2 major divisions in the New Testament. Same idea. And so what the writer to the Hebrews does here, he's already referred to the Torah when he referred to Genesis and when he referred to Melchizedek. And he already referred to Psalm 110, the writing, or the songs of the Tanakh. And now he refers to one of the major prophets. And this prophet is the prophet Jeremiah. And this is the point that he makes. He's really driving home the idea that he has stated here in verse 6, that the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, and it is founded on better promises. And so what he's really driving home is this idea that this covenant that Jesus is the priest of is a better covenant relationship than a covenant based on, if you do this, then God will do that. And he's like, oh yeah, if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, then no place would have been, then you wouldn't have needed another. But God continually found fault with the people. And that's the downfall of a law-based relationship with God, or a relationship with God that says, if I do this, then God will. That's basically it. And you see this all over the place in American Christianity and all of Christianity today, that if I give up this vice, if I give up the alcohol, if I commit myself to Christ, if I go to mass 3 times a week, if I go to the confessional booth, if I make a decision for Christ and I really, really mean it this time, or if I decide to get baptized again, then God will finally forgive me. Then God will finally love me. Then my sin will finally be paid for. That's the exact same thing that we're dealing with here in Hebrews, that they were dealing with, that we're really dealing with in the world around us today. This continual idea of a law-based relationship with God. And if I do this, then God will do that. And what he's really reiterating for us, for you and for me, is that we have a better covenant, because the relationship and this covenant relationship, this contract that we have with God, yes, it's a legal binding contract that we have with God, is mediated by Jesus. It is superior to the old, that covenant of if then. And what he doesn't mention here, but he mentioned previously, this covenant based on the promises of God actually predates any other law-bound covenant of God. And so he brings in, he's referred to the law and the Psalms, and then he brings in this prophet. And this section, verses 8 all the way down through verse 12, is straight out of Jeremiah 31. And it's really just God detailing this new covenant. And what you really have to have in the back of your mind is Passover night in the upper room, Maundy Thursday, when Jesus says, take and eat, take and drink. This is my blood of the new covenant, or this is the new covenant in my blood. That a covenant is a contract sealed by blood, where both parties partake in that blood. Either, all the way back to Abraham, or, when Abraham cut the animals in two. Abraham wasn't committed to that covenant. God was the only one who committed himself to that covenant by passing between the pieces, but it was still a very bloody scene. At Mount Sinai, the people were marked with the blood of that covenant as Moses sprinkled it on them, and as Moses sprinkled it on the Ark of the Covenant. There's that word again, covenant. That ark, because it contained, that ark, inside of that ark contained the stipulations of the covenant, or the relationship with the people. And God says, I will make a new covenant. Awesome. This is good. this is really good. With the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. When Jeremiah is writing this, it's like 590, 585, right around there, shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem. The house of Israel, the 10 northern tribes of Israel, have been gone for nearly 130, 140 years. But God says that he will, in the future, make a new covenant with the house of Israel. That's important, because it must be something greater than the Israel that wasn't in existence anymore, because there were a few remnants from Israel who are still in existence at the time of Jesus. You think of Anna from the tribe of Asher. You think of Saul, renamed Paul, or emphasizing his name, Paul, from the tribe of Benjamin, but you don't really hear about any others from those 10 northern tribes. But the fact that Jeremiah refers to this house of Israel and house of Judah opens our eyes a little bit, that this is just broader than the physical nation of Israel when God is talking about this covenant. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, green being the old covenant. When I took them by the hand, because the reason that God isn't doing that again, because they did not remain faithful. And as a result, because they broke their side of the covenant, God turned away from them. God kept his side of the covenant, and part of the stipulations of his side of the covenant were to turn away from his people when they rejected their side of the covenant. And so God says, we're not doing that again. Partly because we're at a different point in salvation history, and partly because God knows our human fallibility, and he prefers this new covenant. And so here, beginning in verse 10, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel. And again, you've got that same phrase, the house of Israel. We're talking about the spiritual house of Israel here. And we see that here. And God lays down the stipulations of the covenant here in the second half of verse 10, all the way through verse 12. I'll put these in, I don't know, we'll do yellow. I'll put my law in their minds, write them on their hearts. Number 1, I'll just alternate colors here. I will be their God, they'll be my people. Number 2, no longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. Number 3, and you notice that this covenant with the house of Israel, this new covenant, it's in orange there in verse 10. This new covenant is a completely one-sided covenant, what God promises to do for his spiritual people, the spiritual house. And it's all based on this beautiful word in verse 12. The basis for this covenant is not how the people, whether the people will commit themselves to obeying the covenant, to keeping their side of the covenant. The basis for this new covenant of his law in their minds, write them on their hearts, being their God, and them being his people, is that God promises this: I will forgive their wickedness, and I'll remember their sins no more. Awesome. And so when Jesus says on Monday, Thursday evening, take and drink, this is my blood of the new covenant, this is what he's referring to, that he shed his blood and is as the sacrifice, as well as the one who laid down his life as the priest offering the sacrifice, in order to put this new covenant into place. A covenant that is based on forgiveness from holy God, but that forgiveness is also because the sin has been atoned for. And so, and that's really the bottom line. By calling this covenant new, he made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear. This word new here, talking about something that is new in kind, not new in time. It's, if you wake up tomorrow morning and you're having I can't even think of a good example. Like something that is new in time is something that was totally unknown before. But this is a totally new experience, a different experience entirely, a different in quality. And it's based on this forgiveness. And so if we were to go over to Jeremiah 31, verses
Can I
31,
ask if that is because it still stood, the forgiveness because of the promise of Jesus was around before?
Yes. And this is a different thing. I mean, a different question would be, how are the Old Testament believers saved? They were saved as in the exact same way we are, that God worked through word and sacrament to create faith. Just that their faith was in the Messiah who would come. Our faith is in the Messiah who has come. But God used that covenant of law, that conditional covenant that he enacted at Mount Sinai. He used that for mostly for a historical purpose of keeping his people separate and of keeping them focused on the coming Messiah, focused on that promise. And all of the stipulations of that law-bound covenant, the if you do this, then I will be your God and you'll be my people. All of those stipulations are, overshadowed and indeed even foreshadowed, but I would say overshadowed by all the covenant aspects that God had already made with Abram. That God had already promised to Abram as well, that they still participated in the covenant of circumcision. And that circumcision was really a sign of the covenant that God made back in Genesis 12. So in that sense, you could even say that the Israelites were still living under the promise of God in Genesis 12, even while, for a time, the physical nation of Israel was bound by the law-based covenant of Mount Sinai. And when they didn't hold up their side of the bargain of obeying their God and following him, then God corrected them according to the terms of that covenant. I don't know if that answered your question. What was your... Sorry.
It was that you were saying it's new in kind, but not in, and I just wondered if that kind part was because he's saying it makes it new, but in theory it's been in play.
Yes.
Okay. So then you did.
Yep.
Very well.
I have this on the page.
All right. And so then verse 13, also, when he talks about the very last clause of verse 13, what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear. That maybe that tips the hand a little bit as to when the book of Hebrews was written, the letter to the Hebrews was written. We know that the priests are still offering sacrifices, that they're still working under this old covenant. But when he says that it will soon disappear, I take that as a reference to the pending destruction of the temple that Jesus had talked about back in Matthew 24, 23, 24, 25, that Jesus had talked about then, and that would soon be happening. And that destruction of the temple by the Romans happened in the year 70, in AD 70. And if the letter to the Hebrews were written after Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, then it would be nearly redundant. Or he would have had to write it in a very different way, because after the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people had two contenders for guiding Judaism into the next millennium, really. And they were both students of Gamaliel. The first contender was Saul of Tarsus, that we know as the Apostle Paul, and the second one was, his name just escaped me. It's Yohanan ben something or other. I think that was it. It was another man who had studied under Gamaliel, and it really came down to that question of, are we going to see the fulfillment of Jesus and the destruction of the temple, and that the temple was obsolete and has now passed away? Or are they going to revert to some sort of messianic hope that at the same time did not have an actual place where they would have a temple? And so Judaism takes a turn and bets the house again on a coming Messiah and a future messianic age and a future restoration of a physical nation of Israel, rather than they follow with that one scribe or that one student of Gamaliel, rather than following the other student of Gamaliel, the Apostle Paul, who proclaimed that Jesus was the fulfillment of that messianic promises of the Old Testament. I know I read an article comparing the two, and especially like deathbed confession of the two. Like Paul's deathbed confession is basically Second Timothy. I know that I've run the race, I've finished the race. There is in store for me the crown of life. And the other guy basically saying, man, I hope I've got it right. But as a Christian, you can say, I know I've got it right, not because of what I've done or left undone, but because Jesus is this mediator of a new and better covenant. And if you look at this covenant here in Hebrews 8 or in Jeremiah 31, this covenant is something that God does all the work in. Based on this covenant of forgiving, verse 12, forgiving wickedness and remembering their sins no more. Just to think of that Almighty God who knows everything before it happens and who doesn't forget anything, who he like remembers the future, right? That God has chosen to forget your sin on the basis of his own son's blood, which marks you as a participant in this new covenant. Any other questions? I know there's a little bit more history in this one, because the chapter itself is pretty short, and it's basically a third of the chapter is that quotation from Jeremiah. But it is really interesting to kind of stitch together the Old Testament covenants, and that other one from Exodus chapter 25, I think, is the other interesting one. That was the conditional covenant from Mount Sinai. But we'll look at that another time, probably when we study First Peter.